Welcome to NSL Unscripted, a national security law podcast, brought to you by the National Security Law Department at the U.S. Army's The Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. We bring you conversations and hot topics from NSL practitioners today, and hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of NSL Unscripted. I am your host, MAJ Emily Bobenrieth, Associate Professor in the National Security Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. Today, I am so excited to bring to the podcast Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Schieman, Academy Professor in the Department of Law and Philosophy at the United States Military Academy. Colonel Schieman originally commissioned in 2003 from West Point as a Black Hawk pilot. His operational service includes 24 months deployed to Iraq and over 1,000 combat flight hours. In 2012, he completed his master's in philosophy from Georgetown, and in 2022 completed a PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. His expertise and scholarship focuses in the areas of ethics and philosophy of technology, as well as the philosophy of the mind and philosophy of science. I had the pleasure of meeting Colonel Schieman back in May at the Future of Warfare and Law Symposium, co-hosted by the Strauss Center for International Security and Law at UT Austin and the Lieber Institute. Colonel Schieman presented on his research at the intersection of trust and autonomous weapons, and I knew after hearing his presentation, I had to try to convince him to come on the podcast and share the same with our listeners. And lucky for me and for all of you out there, he graciously agreed. This is also a historic podcast because Colonel Schieman is our first non-lawyer guest and our first philosopher, which is honestly just very cool to say. And Colonel Schieman brings years of practical, operational, and academic experience, and I am stoked to bring him and his perspective to the podcast today. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation we started at FuturesCom.
Absolutely. So, sir, I'd sort of like to take this episode in three parts. I'd like to start with a case study that you used down in Austin that helped to demonstrate and kind of lay the groundwork for the potential impediments when it comes to trust for autonomous weapons. Then we'll talk the philosophy piece and deep dive into trust versus trustworthiness, and then end on why this is a legal issue, specifically how trust in these systems from both a philosophical, ethical, and legal perspective is relevant to the question of command responsibility. So, starting with part one, this case study, you talked about this automated ground collision avoidance system, the AGCAS, which is a system that the Air Force now uses but started to develop many decades ago. And you use this example, like I said, to sort of lay the groundwork to frame the trust discussion. So what is it? And can you help me sort of use it to set the stage for the podcast?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think the first thing I want to point out is this system, the automatic ground collision avoidance system, is in some ways like a best case in terms of how we would go about integrating an autonomous system with human users to the benefit of the mission, to the benefit of safety. And what I think is so interesting about it is, despite that fact, it actually is going to lead to some challenges in adoption that the Air Force has really had to work through over the last decade, and some of which maybe we couldn't have fully anticipated until we started fielding the system. So the question that you asked is, what is AGCAS? And really, the system was designed starting in the early 1990s. It was a Lockheed Martin Skunk Works project that they were working collaboratively with NASA. And they were trying to solve a problem of controlled flight into terrain. So the Air Force was averaging 4 to 5 aircraft loss a year due to what they call CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain, which essentially means an otherwise well-functioning aircraft flies into the terrain, resulting in a loss of aircraft, and in many cases, the loss of the pilot. And there are many reasons that these kinds of accidents happen. One is just high G maneuvers cause the pilot to black out, go into what they call G-lock, and then they're not in a position to recover the aircraft. So if the aircraft's in a disadvantageous attitude, it could end up colliding with the terrain. It can happen for other reasons. The pilot becomes spatially disoriented. They lose sight of the horizon. This is a pretty common cause of accidents in general. And it could just be from pilot overload. We ask pilots to do a lot of things. They're flying the aircraft. They may be engaging and managing targets. They may be talking on radios. So occasionally the pilot will become distracted or task saturated. Whatever the case is, a pretty frequent loss of aircraft and loss of pilots because these aircraft are just flying into the ground. And so the Air Force was trying to find a system or develop a system that would essentially monitor the attitude of the aircraft, it would monitor the altitude of the aircraft, the airspeed, and map the terrain and determine if the aircraft was at risk. And if it was, intervene on behalf of the pilot to recover the aircraft, put it in a safe attitude, and then hand control back over to the pilot. So really, like I said, this program started in the early 1990s. By the by 2014, I believe they were in the process of trying to field this with the F-16, which was an aircraft that suffered high rates of controlled flight into terrain, probably because it also performs an attack role. So it's operating in some cases in closer proximity to the ground. But they've subsequently integrated it also into the F-35. So this is a system that the Air Force is now using in a number of its aircraft and has had pretty reasonable success. By the Air Force's own accounting, since its fielding a decade ago, the AGCAS system has saved 9 aircraft and along with those aircraft, 10 pilots. So yeah, that's AGCAS.
And in your presentation, sir, you mentioned how the initial fielding at least of the AGCAS didn't go super smoothly with the pilots. Can you talk a little bit about that and what was their hesitation with accepting the system, which, as I understand it, was literally designed to save their aircraft and their lives?
Yeah, of course, Emily. I mean, I think in short order, the answer is the pilots initially really didn't trust the AGCAS system. And what's interesting about that is that the system, by all rights, worked very well by the time the Air Force started to try to implement it into their aircraft, right? This is a system that had really outstanding record in test and evaluation. It not only did the job that it's being asked to do, which is to prevent the aircraft from flying into the ground under these circumstances that are associated with combat aviation, flying F-16s or flying F-35s, but it also did a good job of not activating when it shouldn't, right? You could imagine a system that did really well to prevent the aircraft from flying into the ground, but it activated at all the wrong times, right? So you find yourself in an exercise or in a dogfight, and suddenly the system makes a mistake and it puts you into a gradual climb or it levels the wings and you get shot down. And so it didn't do that. It seemed to work really, really well, both in terms of activating when it should and not activating when it shouldn't. But for a number of reasons, the pilots, they just didn't trust it, right? So in many cases, what was happening is this thing was being fielded operationally. Pilots would go through their pre-flight, they would get ready to take off, they would go in and they would deactivate the AGCAS system. They would just turn it off. They would complete their flight, they would go on. And so essentially what was happening is even though the software was installed and the aircraft was capable of performing this function on behalf of the pilots just weren't using it. And one thing that probably led to this was misinformation, which ironically was sort of perpetuated by the fact that pilots weren't using it. So you would have aircraft that had AGCAS installed that would suffer a controlled flight into terrain, and pilots would say, like, look, see, the system doesn't work. But in reality, the system wasn't functioning. It wasn't operating at the time of the mishap. So then there was this sort of proliferation. Pilots were like, hey, look, it doesn't work anyway. There's no need for it. I've never been in a situation like this where I would have needed it anyway. Why take the risks? So some of that speaks to misinformation about what was actually happening with the implementation of the system, but it also probably speaks to a lack of understanding of the system. So that is to say that, did the pilots understand the things in the environment, whether it's terrain mapping, the altitude, the calculations that AGCAS was engaged in to determine if the aircraft was at risk? Did they understand that well enough to know whether there was a significant risk of accidental activation or a nuisance activation? It seems that initially there probably wasn't sufficient understanding of the system. I think that a number of Air Force studies that really kind of followed on from this initial attempt to field it pointed to a cultural aversion. There were a lot of pilots that said, like, look, I get it. I get why a system like this might be worth having, but I'm a really good pilot. So the odds of it helping me out are really low, and the odds of it causing me some sort of nuisance or undermining my unique skill as a pilot, the risk isn't worth the reward. So there's almost a cultural aversion. And you can see how this might emerge, especially in fighter pilots. The Air Force is very selective, not only about who gets to become a pilot, but who gets to fly fighter aircraft. after flight school. So it's a very selective, very high performance culture. And so there seemed to be a cultural aversion to these sort of pilot aids. It was like, hey, look, we just don't need it. And what this all really led to is a lack of compliance. So people just weren't using AgCAS. And as a result, despite having this exquisite system that was very well designed and subsequently won awards for aviation design when it was fielded in the F-35, pilots just weren't using it.
You talk about the misinformation, the lack of understanding, the culture aversion, all sort of part and parcel to this lack of trust. And if they don't trust the system, they can't use it effectively, or they're just going to, as you mentioned, refuse to use it. So in your presentation, sir, you dug into the difference between trust and trustworthiness. I think that distinction is really important for our listeners to hear you explain, because to me, they sound pretty much exactly the same, but according to your research and the way that you explained it in Austin, it very much is not. And I think it's helpful, again, to understand the furtherance of our conversation. So what is the difference? How is trust different than trustworthiness, and why does that matter?
Yeah, so let me set the stage for this by saying what we might say. You initially said, what was the problem in implementation with AgCAS? And what I want to argue here is that AgCAS was a trustworthy system. It was a system that we had good reason to believe had properties that made pilots safer, that helped them to do their job better, that allowed them to dedicate their limited human attention to the places where it was best directed at any given point in time, but they did not trust it. Right. So if that's possible, if the system itself gave them good reason to trust it, that is to say that if it was trustworthy and they didn't trust it, then that's at least a reason going into this to believe that, in fact, trust and trustworthiness are different things. And so what I want to try and do is explain why we think why a lot of philosophers think there's an important distinction between trust and trustworthiness, and how we might be able to think about this that I think is not only useful in the context of designing and fielding artificial intelligence systems within the military or outside the military, but probably to practicing law in a world where these systems are being implemented with human users, right? Where you have human machine teaming in this really genuine sense. So I want to start with explaining what I think trust is. So here's a way of kind of just defining it. And then I want to point to several things about that definition that I think are really important to focus on going forward. So I want to say that trust is an attitude that a person adopts towards someone or something that relies on them to perform some action and involves some risk on the part of the truster. Now, this could be a very general sort of trust in the sense that we trust a dear friend. I don't necessarily trust them to do a very specific thing. I just trust them in general. I trust them across a wide range of actions. In the case of AI, we seem to be talking about trust in a very narrow sense. Like, I trust something, some software, some system to do a very particular task, job, that sort of thing. But I think the key here is to focus on really three things. First is that trust is an attitude. So trust is an attitude that I adopt towards some other thing. And traditionally, we've always thought of trust as being something that attaches to another human being. So we might say something like, I trust, a person, but I don't necessarily trust my car to get me to work. And if I say that, I'm being a little bit sloppy, right? I might rely on my car, but I don't necessarily trust it. I don't take this attitude towards my car that I do towards people that play really important roles, or where I'm in relationships with them, where I have a certain degree of risk in the way that I orient on them. So you might think of this in terms of not just a friend, but like a therapist. If you're confiding in somebody these very deeply held beliefs, experiences, secrets, then you certainly don't want to be in the case where you are assuming some risk. If they betray that trust, if they violate their obligations to you as a therapist, they could put you in a very difficult situation. The idea is, when we're talking about AI here, we're talking about adopting an attitude towards some non-human system that's performing a very specific role, and you're really assuming some risk in adopting that attitude towards the thing. Which gets me to the second point that I think is really important about trust. By its nature, it involves a subjective evaluation by the truster of the trustworthiness of the system that they're trusting. So if we're talking about AgCAS, if I'm going to trust AgCAS, then I'm making a subjective evaluation of AgCAS and whether it's an appropriate object of my trust in this very specific context, which is intervening on my behalf to recover the aircraft in case where I put the aircraft at risk. So it's an attitude. It involves a subjective evaluation. And the key here is the third thing, if we have a good reason to trust, and we want to say that that trust is rational or it's well warranted, which is to say that I have a good reason to adopt this attitude based on my assessment of the thing that I'm trusting. But there's no way of completely reducing the risk because I have to make a judgment about a thing that I can't ever know for certain. I can have better or worse reasons to trust, but the idea is like, no matter what, there's no way to completely eliminate the risk in trusting. That's just what it is to adopt that attitude. I don't want to call it a leap of faith, but there's this recognition that no matter how we've all had experiences where we had great reasons to trust, or we felt we had good reasons to trust, and that trust has eventually been betrayed. And so we want to say is like it's an attitude, it's a subjective evaluation, and in the best case, we have good reasons to trust, but it still involves some residual risk. That's what I think is key about trust. And I'll pause there for a second before I move on to trustworthiness.
No, that makes absolute sense, sir. So it's the subjective piece, some degree of risk. I mean, I think everyone can sort of relate to this in basically every relationship that we have, whether it's friend, whether it's intimate partner, a spouse, depending on that relationship. Different trusts have different, I guess depth maybe is the right word for it in terms of how much you trust a person or thing to do something. But as you said, AI is very specific. We're asking this machine to do a very specific thing. But even then, people might be reticent to make that determination, that subjective determination to trust that thing, even though it's really only designed and perhaps proven to do that specific thing. So you mentioned trust is a subjective evaluation of the trustworthiness of the thing. So it sounds like trustworthiness sounds more like a property of something. Can you sort of explain a little bit about the trustworthiness and the relationship with trust?
Yeah, of course. So I do want to say, just before we move on, I think you see lots of cases where people adopt a trusting attitude towards technology that isn't rational or well warranted. So we've seen lots of cases of this with generative AI, right? So generative AI is prone to hallucinations. It will make things up. It creates, actually, I mean, given the advancement of technology, incredible artifacts of language. Like it creates paragraphs and seems to draw on knowledge of topics, but it's prone to get things wrong in really embarrassing ways. So we've seen very publicly where people trusted that probably because they didn't understand the technology or what it was capable of or what it wasn't capable of. And whether it was in the legal profession, I think there was a pretty famous case where a lawyer was submitting case briefs or something like that, where they'd used generative AI and it hallucinated and it caused probably a lot of public embarrassment and some professional trouble. That's a case where somebody trusted a system that didn't have the properties it should have had to perform the task they were trusting it to perform. So we see this we actually see this all the time where people are trusting things that they shouldn't. And the fact that we can make that judgment, we always go back to, well, what would have given that person reason to trust it in the way that they did? Well, you would have had to have had different properties. So trustworthiness is about the thing that we're trusting. And so you said it yourself, Emily. You said trustworthiness is a property. So it's a property in the object of the trust, of the trustee, that would essentially ground the trust, right? So if it is the case that some object has these properties that make it trustworthy to some particular task, then even though we can't ever know that for certain, then we're not really taking the risks that go along with trusting, right? So the problem is really there's a sort of this epistemic barrier between trust and trustworthiness, where the idea is if I could know for a fact the properties in the thing themselves, the thing that I'm trusting, then I wouldn't be in this situation where I'm taking the risks that I'm taking. And it seems that we have some advantages and disadvantages with technology that we may or may not have with human beings. But the key is recognizing that trustworthiness is a property of the thing itself, and it involves an objective state of affairs. So it involves some qualities that either the object has, that the trustee has or does not have. And if we could know that for certain, then we could actually trust without taking any risk. The problem is, like, we never have direct access, at least with human beings, and maybe or maybe not with artificial intelligence, to whether or not the system, the trustee has the right properties. So I gave you three things that I think were important about trust. And I think the three things to take away for trustworthiness are: one, that it is a property. It's a property of the trustee. And two, that it does involve an objective state of affairs. The object either has those properties or it doesn't. But there seem to be a lot of cases where we can't ever have perfect knowledge of whether or not that state of affairs obtains, right? And then the last thing I want to point out about trustworthiness is we have tended with human beings to talk about trust. Trustee has to be competent and appropriately motivated to act. And it seems like when we're talking about AI, the competence criteria seems to be the one that we focus on. And I'm not sure what to make out of the motivational component, right? What would we say that AgCast's motivations are? That's a difficult question to answer, right? I mean, its motivation is sort of the extent of its programming, and I think it's a simple case because I think it's a fairly classically programmed software. It's fairly deterministic compared to what you would get out of like large language models or something, where the same inputs would generate different outputs. Presumably, the same inputs should always generate the same outputs from AgCast. But I think what you see there is, like, if it's about not just competence, I mean, if you have a mechanic that every time you bring the car to them, you get the car back and three new problems emerge, right? They never fix the problem. They might be the best intentioned mechanic in the world. They might be honest. They might be all these other things, but I shouldn't really trust them to work on my car because they lack the competence. So I don't know if this is a difference between trust with AI systems and trust with human beings. But traditionally, we've talked about trustworthiness. We've had this sort of competence component and this motivational component. And there's a difference there in making judgments about the trustworthiness of an AI system. And I'm not sure how we should reconcile that, but I think it's important to notice that there is a difference in terms of how we make these judgments about trust in the context of human beings and how we ought to make them, or what we need to evaluate to make trustworthiness judgments in the context of artificial intelligence or non-human systems.
Yes, sir. No, that makes absolute sense. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the trustworthiness and the trust. It almost seems, these words and the way that we're defining them, as a lawyer, and there are many lawyers listening out there, we always say words matter. They really matter in the legal profession. But here, does it matter what we call it? And what I mean by that is trust the right word? Or perhaps in this context with AI, should we be thinking about maybe justified confidence? Or does it not really matter at all what word we use, more so that we're aware of the concepts behind what we're talking about when we're thinking about the relationship, if that's what you want to call it, between humans and emerging artificial intelligence?
Yeah, Emily, that's a great question. What I will say is I agree with you. Words do matter. I will say I don't have strong feelings about whether we ought to call the attitude that we adopt towards artificial intelligence systems trust or something else, right? Another popular word for non-human artifacts would be reliance in the philosophical literature. Like, I don't trust my car. Like I said before, I rely on it. The Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office has started to adopt the term justified confidence rather than trust. They say we shouldn't trust these AI systems. We should have justified confidence in their performance. And so in that sense, there is this semantic issue, like, how are we using the word? What do we mean when we say, we trust AgCast, or we rely on AgCast, or we have justified confidence in it, whatever. But I think the point that I'm getting at here is really conceptual, which is to say that even if we call it trust, or even if we call it justified confidence, underlying that is this conceptual issue. And that conceptual issue is that whatever we call it, there's this distinction between the attitude we're adopting towards the thing, the artificial intelligence system, AgCast, whatever it happens to be, and the properties that the thing has. And if we recognize that those are distinct, which is to say that I might trust something that's not trustworthy, like the confidence scheme, Bernie Madoff, right? I might trust Bernie Madoff to invest my money, but he was not trustworthy. He did not have the properties that made him a good steward of my money to manage my investments, whatever. And so if we realize that can happen, or in the case of AgCast, so we can have this exquisite and objectively trustworthy system and people can lack trust in it, then what it suggests is that in adopting artificial intelligence systems, in developing them and fielding them, we have sort of distinct lines of effort. And if what we focus on doing is developing these exquisite systems that can do these incredible things in the world, and we don't attend to the fact that there will be human users that have to adopt the appropriate attitude towards them to realize their potential benefits, then we're going to fall short in realizing a more effective force or a better world through these technologies. That I think that's the conceptual issue that I'm trying to point to here. And like I said, I'm actually comfortable with any of those terms as long as we recognize that this conceptual issue underlies any semantic token that we're going to attach to the concept that we're talking about when we talk about what is the attitude we're adopting towards these artificial intelligence systems.
So when you boil it down, we have an attitude adopted toward a thing and the properties that that thing has. So when we talk about AdCAS, we've already talked about how the pilots developed this attitude toward this system that arguably was proven to be very effective. So it objectively had these properties that they should have trusted it, but they ultimately didn't. And it took a very long time for them to do it. When we think about AdCAS, though, it's a preventative system, if you will. It's a system of last resort, and it's really designed to do, as you said, one thing. But when we talk about autonomous weapons, those are going to be proactive systems that are going to go out and identify targets and make targeting decisions. So very different in nature than AdCAS. So when we think about how these proactive systems, potentially lethal systems, are implemented throughout our military as time goes on, should we think through how military commanders might challenge and struggle to adopt a trusting attitude towards them? Again, even if they're proven to be very effective, what can we learn from AdCAS when we think through the implementation of these proactive, lethal systems in commands that may or may not trust them because they are not familiar with them, and it's new, and therefore it's suspect.
Yeah, I think when I introduced AdCAS, when we first started describing the system, I said in some ways it's sort of an ideal case, and one way it's as you described, a system of last resort, right? So I think that in terms of simplifying the process of how do you go about getting people to trust the system, in practice, what wound up happening is, and this actually a secondhand account from an Air Force pilot that a colleague of mine interviewed at Lincoln Labs a couple of years ago, that was actually in one of these wings. And essentially the wing commander just said, hey, I am by policy mandating that you guys are going to use a system, and we are going to check in the post-flight records that the system was active throughout the period of the flight, and you're just going to use it. And if you don't use it, you're going to be subject to penalty, right? I mean, this is one of the advantages that you'd think we have in the military. We can just require people to do things, right? It's kind of one of the things we're famous for. You can just command. And so what wound up happening is people developed trust because they had to use the system. And there's probably no better evidence for the trustworthiness of a system like AdCAS than having somebody that you respect whose life has been saved by an activation of the AdCAS system. You have these, essentially you require people to use it, and you start having what they call saves. We have these activations where somebody that otherwise would have flown into the ground survives. And I mean, I'll tell you from my own perspective, like there's nothing that makes you more of an advocate for wearing your seatbelt than being in an accident where it saves you from serious injury or death. And so what wound up happening is trust developed in the system because people used it and it demonstrated its effectiveness. But again, it's a system of last resort, and it's incredibly well designed, and it's clear what makes it well designed. Activates when it needs to, saves the aircraft, doesn't activate when it shouldn't. Like you couldn't have a clear articulation of what makes the system effective. And I think what really interests me about this is what was a really effective way of getting people to trust AdCAS was requiring that they use it. But I don't know that we can rely on that approach going forward, especially where we're talking about systems that are making decisions about things like targeting, things that aren't systems of last resort, things that touch on notions of command responsibility. So there's an incredibly important relationship between the notion of trust and how we exercise command responsibility in practice. And we recognize this. We always talk about the importance of cultivating trust in our units, trust between commands and soldiers and airmen and sailors, and trust between soldiers and sailors and airmen. And the idea is that we think that the exercise of trust, taking this attitude, is a really important mechanism through which we can not just manage violence, manage mission, accomplish mission, but do it in a way that recognizes limits of proportionality and distinction, that we can do this and we can do it in an ethically justifiable way, and we can deliver harm to the people that we're justified in delivering harm to, not the people that we aren't. So the challenge here is that we seem to need to develop trust if we're going to field systems that aren't just systems of last resort. But then there's an open question of how do we go about doing that, because these systems cognize the world very differently than we do. And one of the challenges, it's not like one approach. AI is a range of different approaches, and they're constantly proliferating. Researchers in artificial intelligence are finding new ways to solve different computational problems and using different methods that are good at some things and bad at others. And so you have a real challenge. How do you develop this understanding? And so I think that the real demonstration of AgCast is by saying, like, even in the best case, the Air Force really struggled to field this. And presumably it was the smallest possible imposition into the pilot's autonomy. And there are other systems that also represent small imposition that are related, right? There's already a system, air-to-air collision avoidance, which is the same sort of thing. It's monitoring the air-to-air environment, the airspace around the aircraft to try and prevent aircraft from flying into one another, and could intervene on the pilot's behalf. And you could imagine a system that also helps defend the aircraft against surface-to-air threats or air-to-air threats, where it maneuvers the aircraft or auto-dispenses flare and chaff. And so what you start seeing is all these small but potentially more significant impositions on autonomy. And I don't think they represent anything nearly as significant as sacrificing some of the autonomy that a commander has over controlling decisions about the types of engagements that their soldiers are engaging in.
Sir, when we talk about command decisions, from a legal perspective, we think command responsibility. As you mentioned, commanders make decisions, and I always tell all the students that come through the JAG school, as legal advisors, we're just merely advisors. We don't actually make any decisions. It's the commander that bears the burden and that risk. And you actually wrote in a publication in 2022 for the Journal of Military Ethics, quote, "Moral responsibility in war is always shared between those doing the killing and those who direct them to do violence," end quote. And that's absolutely true, that from a moral perspective, but also in a legal sense, all U.S. uniformed commanders bear the legal burden of command responsibility, which under U.S. policy, it's defined as a duty to supervise and control subordinates' observance of LOAC. Criminal liability for commanders attaches when a commander, of course, orders violations of LOAC, disregards allegations of LOAC, ignores knowledge, whether actual or constructive, of LOAC violations, incites or acquiesces to the violation, or fails to control troops committing violations. I want to focus on that actual or constructive knowledge piece, which could be arguably the least clear. So actual knowledge, of course, is that direct knowledge of certain events. I directly witnessed this violation, versus constructive knowledge. Commander should have known under the circumstances with the information at the time that a LOAC violation would occur. So when we think through commanders making the decision, owning the risk to use new generations of autonomous weapons, how do you think we apply this known or should have known? What needs to occur? How can commanders understand this technology in order to foresee an outcome when we're talking about constructive knowledge in relation to command responsibility, sir?
Yeah, so Emily, I think that's really the question, right? And I think there's an educational and a training component. And I think we need to think really long and hard about not just how we test and field new systems, like how we prepare end users to understand the limitations of the system. What are the design and testing constraints? What can we expect this system to do well, and what can we expect it to do poorly, and in very specific terms. But there's also an educational component, and teaching at the military academy, I find myself, especially in the context of tech ethics, thinking about the importance of tech literacy, which is to say that if there are all of these new mathematical methods that people are using to do research in artificial intelligence, and there are all these different kinds of systems, and those different systems have different kinds of limitations, what's the basic background? What's the basic educational background that somebody needs to bring to the field with them to be receptive to that training, right? And we have this challenge, which is that we can't expect everybody that's a commander in the military to have a PhD in machine learning, artificial intelligence, or something like that. But the question is, how do we give them the tools to understand these sort of sometimes subtle and important distinctions between using one kind of artificial intelligence and another? And so I think the one question is, how do we create tech literate officers? How do we create tech literate soldiers? What's a reasonable expectation? For my own view of it, I think that in some ways, the broad liberal arts education that we've sort of prided ourselves on at the military academy is probably a good model. You have to understand some math, you have to understand some science, you have to understand some engineering, but you also have to have some grounding in the humanities. You have to understand that these systems that are being fielded are, I mean, they're being used for very human purposes and to accomplish very human goals. But I think beyond that, you have to understand very clearly, once you've fielded a system, what is it that the commander needs to know about that system in order to make a good judgment about what it is likely to do in a given circumstance? A system that's designed well to operate in a desert environment, given the limitations of a lot of the cutting edge technology and machine learning, may not operate well in an urban environment. And if a commander doesn't understand that about that system, then that could be a real liability, not just from the perspective of the commander's legal liability for wrongful killing, but in terms of mission accomplishment versus mission failure. So I think there's a range of issues that systems like, not necessarily AgCast, but systems that we're looking at developing and fielding that help augment, in the ideal case, human cognition and human decision making. I think there's some real challenges in how we prepare people for that, both in the broad sense of like, what's the necessary background, what's the educational component, but also what does training look like with these sophisticated systems and artificial intelligence systems that we're moving very quickly to try and develop and field.
That's a great point, sir. And, previously I said that as a legal advisor, I don't make any decisions. I'm just giving advice. But I say that with an asterisk, because I can tell you in the 2 brigades and 1 one-star command that I've advised, those commanders and the subordinate commanders, they always want their lawyer in the room. And if you're a trusted advisor, if you've gained their trust, they almost always go with what you recommend. It's just the nature of the beast. So while I'm not making the decision, your opines and your legal advice are very heavily weighted. So with that, would you say that requirement to have just a basic understanding so you can make for a commander, make informed decisions, but for us, it'd be to provide competent legal advice? What are your thoughts on saying that the same also is true for legal advisors, that we need to understand at a basic level, have some sort of tech literacy?
Yeah, so the 2022 paper that from Journal of Military Ethics that you referenced a little bit earlier, I think a big theme in that paper is I think there are certain things that we tend to overestimate the impact that artificial intelligence has, that artificial intelligence is just sort of a thing above and beyond, that we don't have any precedent for dealing with this kind of technology. And I think there are probably some ways that is true, but I think we tend to exaggerate it. And so I guess I have a question really kind of in response to your question, which is to say that when you're giving command legal advice to a commander about an engagement, I would assume, I mean, is there some sort of constructive knowledge piece that you have to have as a lawyer, which is to say that knowing the collateral harm risks of using one weapon system versus another, like I would assume the lawyer has to be fairly versed in the weapon systems that their unit, that their brigade is using in order to be able to give good legal advice.
Yes, whether that's, in the traditional sense with the fire section. So, I have sat in a JOC and I have had targets come through to ensure that the CDE estimate is within our authorities. And I was lucky enough to go to the CDE class, and I also took the weaponeering class that the Army provides. But even if you can't do that, I encourage all of our students who come through here, especially the OBC students, if you can't get to one of those courses, at the very least, you have to sit down with those fires folks and you have to ask them what they do for a living, and they will love talking to you about it. But if you don't have that basic level of conceptual knowledge of the weapon systems they're using, there is no way you can advise competently. The same is true for technology. I have also lived that, advising in intelligence law up at Fort Meade. I had no prior intelligence backgrounds, but I'd get these con ops, right, that would have described the tradecraft and the methods they were using, and it was just completely foreign language to me. And so again, I had to sit down and discuss with the operators, like, what does this mean? What are you doing? What do you mean by this? Because otherwise it's just not possible. So you're absolutely right, sir. And that's why I think your fantastic point that I reiterate to our students all the time, that commanders need to understand as these things develop. It's on the legal advisors to also understand, because those commanders rely on our advice, and you can't give informed advice if you don't know what the heck this thing is doing.
I mean, my overall talking point on this is exactly consistent with that, Emily, which is that you can't do the philosophy of technology from the armchair, which is to say that if we're going to figure out how to use a given system well, whether that's in a military context or a non-military context, then we're going to have to know something about the system, right? And we've probably all gone through this, because most of us, I would assume, especially anybody with a technological bent, has enjoyed playing with ChatGPT over the last 2 years, right? Since it was sort of publicly available. And in playing with it, we kind of learned, what does it do well? What does it do poorly? We may have even done some research on how transformers work, or what the algorithms are, or the training data, or how are they training these systems. But I think that kind of fluency is what we're going to need to do, because I think the one key difference here, and you kind of alluded to it with your work in intelligence and collateral damage estimates, is that in many cases, it's not enough to know what the collateral damage estimate is. You kind of have to know how that number is being derived, and what it models well and what it models poorly. And if you can't, I mean, in some ways, if you can't make that further judgment about the judgments of these artificial intelligence systems, about when it's more likely to be reliable or when it's less likely to be reliable, then you've essentially put yourself in a situation where you can't provide any better legal advice than the calculation that's being given to you by the collateral damage estimate, or the AI system that's processing a lot of data and making some sort of recommendation, even if it's got a confidence interval. So the idea is, I think that it's not different in the sense that we need to be cognizant of the systems we're using in a very particular way to use them well. I think the kinds of things we might need to be familiar with in order to arrive at that point, in order to make those judgments, that might be a little bit different. And the sort of technological bar to entry might be a little bit higher or different than it has been for many of the systems that lawyers like yourself have been offering advice on for a long time now. So I think there might be some technical differences in terms of where the technology is going and what you need to know to get there. But I don't think in principle it's any different in terms of, like, hey, you've got to know this stuff. And if the future force is going to be AI enabled, and that seems to be the direction the force development is going, and going quickly, then you need to be fluent in what AI is. Like, what are the different techniques people are using, and why are they using this versus that? And I think that kind of tech literacy is just going to be increasingly important, not just for lawyers, but also for commanders and users, as all of these systems are being fielded, and fielded quite quickly, it seems.
I could not agree more, sir. And with that, I think it's about time to wrap up. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for, one, paving the way as our first non-lawyer and first philosopher on the podcast, and two, for your expertise and perspective. They're incredibly relevant, super thought-provoking, and I just really appreciate your time. Do you have any final thoughts, sir, before we wrap up today's episode?
I just want to say thank you for bringing me on the podcast. I think there's an interesting thing with AI where, as we're studying these artificial intelligence systems and we're developing systems that are able to do things that previously only humans were able to do, we keep finding these important philosophical problems that philosophers have been thinking about for a long time come into sort of practical relevance, and trying to resolve really practical issues like, hey, we developed this really cool system. How do we get the pilots to trust it and use it? And I just appreciate your thoughtfulness and reaching out to me and asking me to talk about trust with an audience of mostly national security lawyers. And I look forward to all of the opportunities it provides for collaboration between lawyers and philosophers, particularly in the DoD space in the future. So thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
This episode of NSL Unscripted was brought to you by the National Security Law Department at the U.S. Army's the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. The views presented are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or its components, the Department of the Army, or the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. Our department also produces the Operational Law Handbook, accessible online. We hope you have enjoyed this episode and look forward to future episodes for NSL practitioners. Thank you.